thank you.
All of us would like a little extra cash, but only a few are prepared to steal a life to get it. An expensive habit milks a husband dry.
Approximately $1 million had been spent.
A sweet demeanor masks a dark fantasy.
She'd see a horror movie and she'd imagine committing that murder.
And chasing the American dream at a lethal cost.
She worshiped the almighty dollar. The only thing that really turned her on was gambling and sex. Life as she knew it was about to be over. She panicked. And it wasn't pretty.
In March 2014, in Independence, Missouri, as residents wind down for the weekend, the suburban calm is shattered. 49-year-old Kirsten Stevens is distraught. She's just found her husband, Charlie, shot dead.
They killed Charlie. There's blood. He's dead. Come here.
Kirsten had been gone all day running errands, and she came home and found her husband dead.
It appeared that he was asleep. He still had the covers on his body. It didn't appear that he struggled in bed.
His hand was still clutching the sheet, probably in surprise and in pain.
I knew we'd been robbed, and I went into the bedroom and I turned on the light.
Kirsten is inconsolable. The police baffled.
She thought it must have been a robbery, that the house was burglarized.
And what's missing?
I'm sorry, what?
You said you were robbed? Can you tell me what was taken?
Oh, they took my husband. Isn't that enough?
Kirsten's departed husband, 65-year-old Charlie Stevens, was 14 years her senior. They were a love story, starting in the workplace.
Charlie had been married for 40 years, had a very stable relationship with his wife.
Here he was, a stable man who saved his money, had a very nice house.
But his stability is about to be rocked by a flirtatious new recruit.
Take me out to dinner?
Dinner?
Kirsten worked very hard to get Charlie's attention.
Okay.
Okay.
Kirsten was successful in turning Charlie's head.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Here, take a seat.
Kirsten seems to offer Charlie something he's been missing.
Comfortable?
Yes, very.
The relationship started off with an affair.
What?
I just feel so lucky.
Oh, that's sweet. I feel lucky too.
He met a younger woman. She was 14 years his junior. This was new and exciting to him.
Yes, we won!
And he ended his 40-year relationship with his wife.
It's a sweeping change to Charlie's life. He marries Kirsten and retires, with considerable savings for a comfortable second phase to his life, which suits his new wife perfectly.
Kirsten had a very serious gambling problem.
As the years pass, all the money dries up, and Charlie is forced out of retirement into a part-time job.
They were basically flat broke. He was having to work at a hardware store.
Charlie! Oh. Hi, Rob. What the hell are you doing here? I thought you were retired.
Oh, yeah, I have, but I got bored at home. Just keeping busy.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you.
Addictions rule people's lives, whether it's smoking or drugs or alcohol or gambling.
Their financial predicament becomes so dire, they can't afford to pay taxes.
They weren't happy. Neighbors would report hearing screaming coming from the home on a regular basis. It was very, very apparent that their main issue was money.
I saw the money you withdrew. We need that to pay our tax debt.
So, do an overtime shift at the hardware store.
The only way out of this terrible debt caused by her gambling problems was to sell the house and to use the proceeds of it for back taxes.
Do you want to lose the house?
So we'll move.
At that point, he was pretty much beaten man.
In Independence, Missouri, the Stevens household is in turmoil thanks to Kirsten's gambling addiction. But when she discovers Charlie's life insurance policy, with her as the beneficiary, Kirsten starts doing some research.
She was looking up how to cut brake lines.
Another one was how to kill your spouse.
Really might as well have been how do you kill your husband named Charlie.com.
He's worth more to me dead than alive.
She made the comment to friends that Charlie was worth more to her dead than alive.
By 2014, the house is sold to pay back taxes, and pressure increases when the new owner arrives to take possession.
Hi, I'm Craig.
Hi.
I'm the guy that bought the house.
It all came to a head the day that the new owner showed up,
You do know you have to be out by Friday, right?
saying, "This is my house, you need to get out. I want to inspect the premises."
Sure. Come in.
Thank you.
How was she going to continue her addiction?
My bed?
She was stunned and upset. She knew that her gravy train was coming to an end.
Life as she knew it was about to be over. She panicked.
Don't worry about my dad. Once he's down for his nap, nothing will rouse him.
Kirsten told him that was her dad. She thought that she had to do something and do something quick.
It was really nice to meet you.
There was one last thing Charlie might be able to do for Kirsten, and that was die.
Charlie's life insurance is Kirsten's lifeline.
She was relying on that to continue her gambling lifestyle.
She went and got a .22 caliber rifle, and while Charlie is laying in bed, she shoots him 4 times. She didn't care about Charlie. She took advantage of him. Once his money was gone, she tossed him away just like trash.
She was done with him when his money ran out. She was ready to move on.
Kirsten hides the murder weapon. She sets the scene of a bungled robbery and leaves the house.
And then when she comes home, she acts like she's shocked.
Got herself all revved up and hysterical and ran to the neighbors saying,
They killed Charlie! There's blood! He's dead!
"They shot him. They shot him."
But when police arrive, they smell a rat.
There was stuff everywhere, so I knew we had been robbed.
You can tell when somebody's trying a little too hard. That was our first indication that something may not be right.
You said you were robbed? Can you tell me what was taken?
Oh, they took my husband! Isn't that enough?
Kirsten's story just doesn't hold up.
She couldn't identify anything that was really missing.
We started realizing that there weren't really any signs of a robbery. We all started kind of questioning what happened.
More questions arise over Kirsten's whereabouts.
How long were you out?
I told you I was out all day.
She was trying to set up an alibi and just did a very poor job of it.
At the casino.
Nothing pans out.
But there's no sign of you on the CCTV.
The police looked at all of the surveillance photos.
We were able to establish that she wasn't where she said she was.
And she found this.
Kirsten stashed the rifle in an access panel of the jacuzzi tub.
It was under the jacuzzi.
Where no one else in the world would put something.
I've never seen that before.
Funny. It's got your DNA all over it.
I think that she convinced herself that she was going to get away with killing her husband.
Rather than plead guilty in exchange for a lesser charge, Kirsten rolls the dice one last time and pleads not guilty to first-degree murder.
Kirsten is a gambler, and if there's a chance that she could walk away from this, she would take that chance.
But her numbers don't come up. In 2016, Kirsten Stevens is convicted of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. She is sentenced to life in prison, no chance of parole.
She was someone who really knew what she wanted, and it didn't matter what she had to do to get it.
When you talked to her, you almost didn't feel like you were talking to a person. Nothing seemed to be absorbed.
Charlie gave Kirsten so much, but she gambled it all away until all she had left was her husband's life. Then she spent that too.
Who would ever believe that someone that you marry and think that you're in love with would ever stoop to that level to just to kill you for money?
The overriding flaw in her character is an inability to feel empathy for other people. If you don't feel empathy, then you don't feel remorse when you hurt someone.
His smiling, lovely Brittany.
A little cutie you were, and you still are.
He was very proud of his family, very proud of his grandchildren.
But there is a side to Brittany Robert hasn't yet met. Back in Queensland, she and roommate, 21-year-old Bernadette Burns,
I'm done with this movie.
have a fetish for the dark side.
She developed an interest in horror movies and killing people.
Her and Bernadette form a very close friendship very quickly.
They would sit and watch endless hours of films. Now, a lot of teenagers develop a little bit of an obsession to horror movies, but Brittany took it even further. She'd see a horror movie and she'd imagine committing that murder.
Watching violence on TV or in a movie over and over and over desensitizes the individual to the violent act.
For Brittany, it's been a trend since childhood.
Brittany! Brittany!
When she was 8 years old, she got mad at her brother.
Brittany!
She picked up a knife in the kitchen and started chasing him through the house.
The knife incident was very telling of something bad going on in Brittany's heart.
Brittany, stop!
Underneath underneath the facade of the sweet, fun-loving little girl was a budding monster.
As a young adult, Brittany takes control of her life and her fantasies.
Well, I like it. No one else likes what I like.
She did things like visit graveyards with her friends, which, you wouldn't think a regular teenager would sort of do.
What if we sell your car? I drive my car. Not often.
The two women don't have steady jobs, so money is often a problem.
I know where there's some cash. And a lot of it.
And now, here's one for my favourite granddaughter.
Brittany's mind runs 1,000 miles away to her doting grandpa in South Australia, who's let slip a secret.
Thanks, Papa. Dad, that's far too generous.
Yeah. What's $600? And another 100,000 where that came from.
Dad.
Robert had talked about the money that he had there and explained in detail to Brittany's mother where that money was.
It's better off with me, it's safer with me than any bank.
He didn't trust banks. He kept all of his savings at home, and it amounted to about $110,000.
When Brittany heard her mother talking to Bob about hidden money, an idea was born. Bob didn't trust banks, but he shouldn't have trusted his granddaughter.
Have to have a strong relationship with someone to convince them to drive across the country to commit a robbery against that person's grandfather.
They travel 1,200 miles, and on August 5th, 2016, arrive at Robert Whitwell's Adelaide home.
Okay, you ready?
But Bernadette has a change of heart.
I can't do it, Britt. We're in this together, whatever it takes, remember? Yeah, but he's your pop. We just came all this way for this. You're fine. You stay in the car.
While Bernadette stayed in the car and put on her makeup, Brittany went inside to have breakfast with her grandpa. What could possibly go wrong?
For Brittany, this is more than a robbery. It's a chance to act out a violent fantasy she's carried since she was a child.
What are you doing here?
I just came to visit you.
Come in. Come in.
She was armed. She had the knife with her when she went inside.
I wish we could do this more often. I really do. Yeah.
He pulls out photograph albums of their childhood.
Oh, look, there's your mum, and there's you.
Recalling fond memories.
Yeah, I want you to take that one with you.
The trip down memory lane softens Brittany.
She starts having second thoughts. She sends a text to Bernadette. She says, I can't go through with this.
The pair should follow their consciences and leave. But instead, Bernadette doubles down.
Brittany chickened out and told her, I can't go through with it. Bernadette was quite the coach. Get in there and do it.
Now, thank you for coming to see me, darling.
Brittany's behind her grandfather. She brings out her knife and she stabs him in the neck.
He's surprised. He turns around, puts his hands on her shoulders and said, Why did you do that? And with that, she reaches up with the knife again and buries it deep in his chest. He would have bled rapidly. And since it's so close to the heart, the majority of the blood would have poured into the cavities of the chest.
He stumbles to get a Band-Aid to stop the bleeding. And Brittany, callous young thing that she is, she actually helps him to put the Band-Aid on.
Sorry, Grandpa.
But that's where her first aid ends. She waits and watches her grandfather bleed to death.
How can you kill your grandfather and be willing to sit there and watch him bleed to death? It was horrific. This is a man who's loved you all your life.
Brittany then texts Bernadette and says, "It's done." 2 words, "It's done."
They rifle through his belongings and find his wallet, and they found $1,000.
The girls have traveled across Australia for much more than that.
They searched the entire house. He had over $110,000 in cash in that house.
But they can't find it.
Hey, where are you? We have to go. I found a bag.
At this point, Brittany's an accomplished killer, but she was a really bad robber. They couldn't even find the money that was hidden in the shed.
Are you sure we shouldn't keep looking? We've looked everywhere. We have to go.
With just $1,000 in their pockets, the girls hit the road. It's days before Robert's body is discovered.
It took 3 days of accumulating newspapers in the drive for neighbors to get alarmed enough to call the police.
The police have no early leads.
He was a good man, and he lived a good life. Poor Grandpa.
At his funeral, Brittany slips easily into the role of grieving granddaughter.
Poor Papa pours out of Brittany's lips over and over again. She acts like the most distraught person to ever hit the planet.
Poor Grandpa.
So I'm guessing those tears on her part were crocodile tears. Look at me, I'm so sad.
The only remorse seems to come from her accomplice, Bernadette.
Bernadette, I said no phone calls.
Who is not coping so well.
Why would you do that?
She was telling her friends, telling her housemates.
Bernadette felt the need to confess to an entire audience by saying, "Story of my life. I didn't want to do it, but I did."
I think she wanted to put it behind her. She knew she'd done the wrong thing.
Crime Stoppers took a call that said, Brittany and Bernadette are responsible for Bob's death.
Looking for a Brittany J. Dwyer?
It was anonymous, but it gave them a place to start.
Their secret soon dissolves away.
In the end, not only did Bernadette confess, but ultimately Brittany confessed to what she had done.
In 2017, Bernadette Burns pleads guilty to murder without intent and receives a minimum of 13 years and 6 months in prison.
Bernadette was not the callous individual that Brittany was. She burst into tears. She said she felt shame.
Brittany Dwyer is convicted of murder. Her sentence, a minimum of 21 years behind bars.
In the courtroom, the judge said she posed clear danger to the public.
On the outside, Brittany Dwyer appears to be a sweet teen, but her fresh-faced looks mask a dark soul.
Brittany was able to kill because she had no empathy for her grandfather. No empathy means no problem.
This easy money could only be easy if you're prepared to take a loved one's life.
This murder was motivated by curiosity and a desire for Brittany to see what it was like to kill someone.
Sign here and initial here.
Greed is a monster that frequently consumes the people that harbor it. She's nothing less than a stone-cold psychopath.
An online romance connects two lonely souls on opposite sides of the world. And soon, 34-year-old Joe Myers invites his Filipino bride, 28-year-old Irene, to make a new life in Wayland, New York.
Well, what do you think?
Joe was lonely and looking for female companionship. Irene was poor and desperate and looking for a guy with a wallet.
It's not quite how I imagined,
I know it's not much.
but it's ours.
Irene leaves behind her family and children from a previous relationship.
Come and meet my staff.
She hopes of better things.
You know, you look at Joe, and he's got a pretty ramshackle home and business.
David, I want you to meet my beautiful wife, Irene. Irene, this is my best buddy, Dave.
Joe runs a small garage with just one employee, 51-year-old David Odell.
They were best friends. They grew up together.
He worked 10 to 12 hours a day for Joe Myers, and he became a real asset for them.
He's a hard worker.
I'll show you the office.
And a simple soul. A childhood injury leaves David with permanent brain damage.
Joe was sort of maybe that big brother figure to him, far more than just an employer. He was employer, he was friend, he was confidant.
Irene settles in, studying as a nurse's assistant, but she misses her family. She decides they would be better here too, if only she had money and her own house.
She figures, let's come up with some different schemes.
In 2015, Irene and Joe offered to buy David's house and let him live there rent-free. The cash is tempting, but David doesn't know the real estate market.
They signed deeds. For what was supposed to be $8,000, about a third of the value of the home, they took it from him.
And things just get worse.
They never made any payments. They were supposed to pay him $1,000 down. That never came.
She never had any intention of paying David any money.
As the new owner, Irene has the right to move in. So she does, to take care of David.
I think he did intend to take care of him, but not the way that most of us would take care of somebody.
Well, I don't need looking after him.
We'll see about that.
She takes charge of his medication.
They took away his seizure medication, I think hoping he would pass away.
Irene, have you seen my pills?
No, don't worry about those.
But I might have another seizure.
I'm a nurse, remember? I'll look after you.
The medication that Irene was supposed to be giving David was found in Joe's desk at his house.
As David plays hide and seek for his life-saving medicine, Irene starts drawing up contracts, insurance contracts.
And they got a homeowner's policy on the house because Irene was the owner. And then Irene got a renter's policy on top of that, didn't disclose that she was the owner, and got another $45,000 policy.
Come on, David. Just sign them. I'm running late.
The house isn't the only thing of value to Irene and Joe.
She's able to take out a $40,000 insurance policy on David.
Why would I need life insurance?
'Cause you're the most valuable employee that I have.
We figured they would have gotten $173,000 to $175,000.
Well, this calls for celebration. Let's go grab a beer, buddy.
Okay, Joe.
She got insurance on the house. Now she has insurance on David's life. Wonder what she needs to do next.
Life for David Odell changes dramatically after his boss, Joe Myers, gets married.
I said that one goes in my bedroom.
His wife, Irene, insists on moving in as his caregiver. And then...
I don't want a beer, Dave. Oh. A company check is missing.
Joe confronts David. He has a run-in with him. He's like, David, I know you wrote a check for yourself for $40 from my business.
Oh, I didn't take $40.
I didn't do that, Joe. Come on, we're friends.
I don't deal with thieves.
But I'm not a thief.
Don't ever set foot on my property again.
Joe says, you know what? I don't want you in the shop anymore, and I don't want you in my life anymore. Get out.
Please, Joe. If I can't come over, then I'll have nothing to live for.
After 18 years loyal service, Joe dispatches his old friend.
Joe, please.
And drowns his guilt at a bar.
Whoa there, cowboy. Okay, there you go.
Damn, Joe. Never seen you this wasted before.
I never had to ask my best friend before.
He makes sure he stands out and makes sure everybody thinks he's very tipsy and very drunk.
He looked me in the eye and he said, if I don't have this job, then I got nothing to live for.
Poor guy.
And I fired him.
If we fired David, he had nothing to live for. Maybe he killed himself.
In truth, Joe isn't that drunk because he and his wife have plans that night. Valentine's Day, 2016.
Good. It's still alive.
He ignites it. Bang!
They found soot in his trachea, which indicates he was breathing his house in as it burned down around him.
Initially, investigators think they are dealing with a tragic accident.
They determined that it was an accident. It was the coldest night of the year, and that David, who was mentally disabled, possibly did something wrong that resulted in an accidental death.
Oh my God, David!
But then, Irene and Joe make an awkward appearance.
Did you know the fella that lived here? He was my best friend all my life.
I see.
This guy was making a scene and he wanted everybody to know he was crying, but I thought to myself, that seems like fake crying, like fake emotions. And Irene was cold, stone cold.
Their good planning starts to fray.
So you came here yesterday?
Last time I saw David would have been yesterday.
What time?
Probably around noon.
And when was the last time you saw David?
We saw him late last night.
Joe and Irene couldn't keep their stories straight. They created 2, 3, 4 different stories.
Fortunately, Joe and Irene didn't have the bandwidth between the two of them to pull off a crime like this.
Suspicions are confirmed when investigators discovered Joe's own security system has recorded their preparation.
Joe thought he was going to get away with this stuff and thought that his security cameras overwrote every couple of days.
Hey, that's invasion of privacy to record in our home.
We didn't. You did.
Confronted with the evidence, Irene flips on her husband.
Who hit David with the hammer?
It was Joe.
Irene blamed Joe that he had big dreams and he wanted more money.
Who hit David with the hammer?
I don't know.
Really? Because Irene said it was you.
He tells a family member, she threw me under the bus.
In 2017, Joe Myers is convicted of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree arson, and criminal conspiracy. His sentence, 23 years to life.
People have been known to do horrible things with another person that they never would have done on their own. Joe had it in him to commit murder, but it took Irene to get it out.
Irene Myers is found guilty of second-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree arson, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and making a false written statement to police. She, too, is serving 23 years to life.
Irene is the one who pulled all the strings in this, planted all the seeds, and she got Joe to be her co-conspirator in murder.
Irene wanted to live the American dream, and she didn't care who suffered to make that happen.
Irene is nothing less than a stone-cold psychopath. She lacks empathy for other people, therefore has no remorse when she hurts them. Irene worshipped one thing in life, the almighty dollar, and that.
The call came in just after midnight, the kind of call that doesn't ring so much as it slices through the room, a shrill interruption that tells you something is wrong before a single word is spoken. And on the other end of the line was a voice that refused to give a name, refused to give a face, offering only a sentence that would echo through the next 2 decades like a gunshot trapped inside a hallway. You're looking in the wrong place. Florida, summer of 2002. The air thick enough to choke on. Heat clinging to skin even after the sun went down. A quiet coastal town where palm trees lined the streets and porch lights stayed on late because people still believed light could keep darkness out. And that belief shattered the morning they found the car. It sat abandoned near the edge of a retention pond, engine cold, windows down, radio still tuned to a local station looping yesterday's news, and inside nothing looked disturbed until you noticed what wasn't there. No driver. No passenger. No trace of the woman who had been seen behind the wheel less than an hour earlier. Her name spread fast, whispered first, then spoken aloud, then printed in bold black type across the front page by noon. 29 years old. Local. Reliable. The kind of person neighbors described with words like normal and quiet, as if those words could shield her from whatever had taken her. She had left work late the night before, told a coworker she'd be home in 15 minutes, joked about reheated leftovers waiting in her fridge, and then she vanished between 2 familiar intersections she'd driven 1,000 times. Police sealed off the area around the car, lights flashing red and blue against the still water of the pond, insects buzzing in the tall grass, the smell of damp earth mixing with gasoline and hot asphalt. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle. Her purse lay on the passenger seat, wallet inside, cash untouched. Keys still in the ignition. To investigators it looked staged. To the community it felt impossible. People don't just disappear like that. Not here. Not her. Search teams flooded the area. Divers dragging the pond. Helicopters circling overhead. Volunteers forming lines to comb through nearby woods, calling her name until their voices cracked. Days passed, then weeks. Flyers faded in the sun. Corners peeling from telephone poles. Candlelight vigils bloomed and withered. The town learned a new phrase and learned it fast. Missing under suspicious circumstances. Detectives retraced her final hours frame by frame, reviewing security footage from gas stations, traffic cameras, storefronts, anything that might have caught a glimpse of her car rolling past. One grainy clip showed headlights turning off the main road. Another showed nothing at all. Her phone records were pulled. Last call logged at 10:42 p.m. A voicemail left for a friend. Her voice relaxed, almost cheerful, ending with a laugh that would later feel unbearable to listen to. No outgoing calls after that. No pings. No digital footprint. In 2002, technology still had blind spots, and she fell straight into one of them. Rumors filled the silence where answers should have been. An argument gone wrong. A stranger lurking near the road. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. Every theory found a mouth to speak it. Every theory found an audience ready to believe it. And police worked through them methodically, interviewing co-workers, ex-boyfriends, neighbors, anyone who had crossed her path in the weeks leading up to that night. Alibis stacked up. Leads went cold. The case slowed, then stalled, then hardened into something heavier, something harder to move. A cold case before anyone was ready to call it that. The car was processed again and again, each time with new eyes, new hands, new hopes that advancements in forensics might coax a secret from the upholstery or the steering wheel. Fibers were cataloged. Smudges were lifted. A single unidentified print surfaced, partial, distorted, never matching anything in the system. Evidence bags filled shelves. Questions filled the gaps. And then, just as the town was learning to live with the absence, the tip came in. Not a confession. Not a name. Just a direction. A payphone call routed through 3 exchanges, a voice filtered and flat, offering a detail that had never been released to the public. A detail that made the detective on duty sit up straighter in his chair. The caller knew something. Enough to matter. Not enough to solve it. Investigators pivoted, eyes turning toward a stretch of land miles from where the car had been found, an area dismissed early on as irrelevant, too far out of the way, too inconvenient, too quiet. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar followed. The soil was turned, then turned again. Nothing. No body. No clothing. No proof. Just disturbed earth and the growing suspicion that someone had gone to great lengths to erase a human being. Years passed. Detectives retired. New ones inherited boxes labeled with her name. The town changed. Businesses closed. New families moved in, unaware of the story beneath their feet, unaware that they were parking cars and planting gardens in a place that still held unanswered questions. The case file thickened with notes written by different hands, different eras of policing, all circling the same black hole at the center. Every so often her face resurfaced on the evening news, older now through digital age progression, eyes still familiar, smile still frozen in time, and each broadcast reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Her family kept a bedroom exactly as it was, dusted, untouched, a quiet refusal to let go. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Hope shifted shape, becoming something thinner, sharper, harder to carry. Behind closed doors, investigators argued. Was the car a dump site? A misdirection? Had she ever reached that road willingly, or had someone else been driving by the time it stopped? The anonymous tip suggested knowledge of a second location, a place where something critical had happened, a place scrubbed clean. But without corroboration, it was just another ghost in a case full of them. Then came the second call. Years later. Same cadence. Same refusal to identify. A voice older now, or maybe just heavier, carrying the weight of time. One new sentence. One correction. A suggestion that the first tip hadn't been wrong, just incomplete. That the truth lay not in what was buried, but in what had been moved. Evidence logged. Evidence misplaced. Evidence quietly altered before anyone realized its value. The implication was explosive. Internal review teams were brought in. Chain of custody records were scrutinized. Old evidence was retested. Some samples were gone. Others were degraded beyond use. Questions that had once pointed outward now curled back in on themselves, aimed uncomfortably close to home. Trust wavered. Whispers grew louder. By the time the case officially earned the label cold case, it wasn't cold at all. It burned under the surface, fueled by doubt, by suspicion, by the gnawing sense that the answer had been close once, close enough to touch before slipping away. Detectives spoke of it in low tones, aware that someone out there still knew more than they were saying. Someone who had watched the years pass and decided silence was safer than truth. And somewhere, in a place no map had yet revealed, the missing woman remained exactly that, missing, her final moments unaccounted for, her story unfinished, her absence a constant presence in a town that would never quite forget the night she failed to come home. The night a normal drive turned into a mystery that refused to stay buried, waiting for the next voice in the dark to speak, waiting for the cold case to break in a way no one was prepared for. The silence after that second call was heavier than the first, the kind that presses down on a room and makes even seasoned investigators uneasy, because silence like that doesn't mean absence, it means restraint, it means someone is choosing their moments carefully. And in Florida the heat rolled on as if nothing had happened, cicadas screaming in the trees while inside the precinct, case files were pulled from shelves and spread across tables like an autopsy of the past, every report reread, every assumption questioned, every detail re-examined with the uncomfortable knowledge that something vital might have been overlooked not by chance, but by design. The anonymous caller had said just enough to fracture the timeline, to suggest that the car was not the beginning of the story but a midpoint, a staged punctuation mark meant to redirect attention, and once that idea took hold it changed the way everything else looked. The route she supposedly drove that night no longer made sense. The time gap between leaving work and the last phone activity stretched too wide to ignore. 15 minutes had become 40. 40 became an hour. An hour became a void. Detectives went back to the streets, this time not looking for what was there, but for what shouldn't have been. A closed business that reported lights on after midnight. A security camera that mysteriously malfunctioned the week after the disappearance. A neighbor who remembered hearing a car door slam, then another, too late at night to be casual, too deliberate to be nothing. Each detail alone meant very little. Together they formed a pattern that didn't point outward, toward some faceless stranger passing through, but inward, toward someone who understood the town, its rhythms, its blind spots. The investigation began to circle around a name that had surfaced early and been dismissed just as quickly, a man with routine access to the area where the car was found, a man whose alibi was airtight on paper and paper-thin everywhere else, supported by time cards and signatures that now raised more questions than answers. In 2002, those records had been accepted without much scrutiny. In hindsight, they looked convenient. Too convenient. When detectives knocked on his door again years later, the neighborhood barely noticed. He had aged into anonymity, another face among many, another life that seemed unremarkable from the outside. He answered questions politely, calmly, repeating the same story he had told before, never contradicting himself, never volunteering information. But something was off. Not fear. Not anger. Control. The kind that comes from rehearsing a version of events until it feels real. Investigators checked his phone records from the time of the disappearance. Most were gone, lost to outdated systems and retention limits, but one anomaly remained. A brief call placed late at night to a number registered to a prepaid phone. The kind that leaves almost no trail. That number, long inactive, had surfaced once before in the case file, flagged and forgotten, linked to nothing concrete. Until now. Forensic accountants traced purchases tied to similar prepaid devices, cross-referencing store receipts, transaction times, locations. A pattern emerged, thin but persistent, leading back to a handful of payphones that no longer existed, ripped out and replaced with parking meters or bus stops. One of those payphones sat less than a mile from where the anonymous tips had originated. Another stood near the stretch of land investigators had searched years earlier, the place the dogs had alerted, the place that had yielded nothing. They went back again. Different season. Different conditions. New technology. The ground had settled since the last search, earth shifting slowly over time, and this time beneath layers of sand and roots, they found something small and unassuming. Something that could have been overlooked easily before. A fragment of fabric. Weathered. Discolored. Consistent with the type of clothing she was last seen wearing. Not proof of death. Not proof of life. Proof of proximity. The discovery reignited media attention overnight. Headlines screamed about a cold case heating up. About anonymous tips and long-buried secrets. The community felt the old shock ripple through it again. Neighbors revisiting memories they tried to bury, parents pulling children closer, conversations lowering in volume when certain names were mentioned. The family was notified quietly, carefully, hope and dread delivered in the same breath. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Internal Affairs reopened its review, focusing on evidence handling during the early days of the investigation. A retired officer was brought in for questioning, then another. Nothing overtly criminal surfaced, but mistakes did. Sloppiness. Shortcuts. Decisions made under pressure that had irreversible consequences. A mislabeled bag. A log entry filled out hours late. Tiny errors that, in a case like this, mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The anonymous caller struck again, as if sensing the shift, as if watching from just beyond reach. This time the voice lingered longer on the line, breathing audible, words measured. "You're closer now," it said. "But you're still missing the point." The point, according to the caller, wasn't where she ended up. It was when control changed hands, when a routine night became something else entirely. Investigators obsessed over that phrase, control. They reconstructed her evening down to the minute, examining who had motive, who had opportunity, who had the psychological profile to orchestrate something so clean it left almost nothing behind. Behavioral analysts weighed in, suggesting a perpetrator who was patient, methodical, comfortable operating in familiar spaces, someone who could approach without raising alarm, someone she wouldn't have immediately feared. Attention returned to her social circle, not just romantic relationships but professional ones, power dynamics, subtle tensions. A supervisor known for crossing lines verbally, never reported, always explained away. Co-workers who recalled awkward interactions, uncomfortable jokes, invitations that went unanswered. At the time, none of it seemed relevant. Now, it took on a different color. One former colleague agreed to speak after years of silence, admitting she had seen the missing woman get into a car that wasn't hers earlier that week, a car she didn't recognize, driven by someone she assumed was a friend. She hadn't mentioned it before because no one had asked the right question. Or maybe because she hadn't wanted to believe it meant anything. That car was never identified. The case expanded, then narrowed, then expanded again, a breathing thing that refused to settle. Warrants were drafted and denied. Search requests stalled in court. Time worked against everyone, memories fading, witnesses moving away or dying, physical evidence degrading beyond usefulness. And yet, the sense that the truth was within reach grew stronger, sharper, almost painful. Late one night, a detective sat alone with the file, flipping through photographs of the car, the pond, the empty driver's seat, and noticed something that had been missed dozens of times before. A reflection in the window, a shape that didn't belong to any known object in the area. Enhanced, isolated, compared against old property records, it matched a structure that no longer existed. A storage building demolished months after the disappearance. A building owned by the same man whose alibi was now under scrutiny. By the time dawn broke, a plan was in motion. The past was being dragged, inch by inch, into the light. But somewhere, someone else was watching too, listening to the news, counting on time to keep its secrets, aware that the cold case was no longer dormant, that the story of Florida 2002 was shifting, tightening, and moving steadily toward a moment that would force the truth out into the open, whether anyone was ready for it or not. By the time warrants were finally signed, the sun had already burned off the morning haze, and the town moved through another ordinary day, unaware that its past was about to be disturbed again, that doors long closed were about to be forced open, that the careful distance time creates between people and their fears was shrinking by the hour. Detectives approached the demolished storage site with measured steps, standing on ground that had been poured over, repurposed, made to look harmless, but beneath the concrete and gravel was a footprint frozen in time, a memory of a structure that had once stood there. A place that existed just long enough to matter, and then disappeared before anyone thought to ask why. Ground-penetrating radar swept the area in slow, deliberate lines, the machine humming softly, indifferent to the tension curling through the air, and when the technician paused, when the screen flickered and showed an anomaly beneath the surface, no one spoke. Because everyone understood what silence meant in moments like this. Excavation crews moved in carefully, peeling back layers as if unwrapping something fragile, something that had waited years for this moment. What they found was not a body, not bones, not the definitive end everyone had braced for. It was worse. A shallow pit, A scatter of items. A rusted chain. A broken watch face. Plastic ties brittle with age. Objects stripped of context, stripped of time, stripped of the ability to speak clearly for themselves. Forensic teams cataloged everything, photographing, bagging, logging, while detectives stood back and did the math in their heads, understanding that these items suggested restraint, confinement, a place where control had been asserted and maintained, a place where someone had taken their time. The news broke within hours. The phrase cold case splashed across screens again, paired with words like disturbing and chilling, and the community felt the shock ripple outward, old conversations resurfacing, old suspicions reawakened. People looked at familiar streets differently now, wondering how much they had missed, wondering what else lay beneath surfaces they trusted. The man whose name had quietly threaded its way back into the investigation was brought in for questioning that afternoon. He arrived without protest, without hesitation, dressed neatly, hair combed, demeanor calm, almost bored. He answered questions with practiced ease, his voice steady, his eyes focused just enough to appear cooperative. When shown photographs of the recovered items, his expression barely shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before settling back into neutrality. He said he had no idea what they were. He said he had never seen them before. He said many things that sounded reasonable until placed side by side. Detectives pressed harder this time, confronting him with the inconsistencies in his alibi, the phone records, the proximity of the demolished structure to both the car and the anonymous calls. Each time he adjusted smoothly, offering explanations that fit just well enough to avoid collapse. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not grow angry. He did not panic. He simply waited for questions to end. While he waited, forensic analysts worked through the night, testing fibers, analyzing residue, comparing the recovered fabric fragment to clothing records, to photographs, to receipts pulled from the victim's home. The match wasn't perfect. Time had taken its toll. But it was close enough to matter. Close enough to suggest that she had been there. Close enough to suggest that the story investigators had been telling themselves for years had been incomplete. The anonymous caller remained silent during this flurry of activity, and that silence was louder than any tip. Detectives speculated endlessly about their role. Witness? Accomplice? Someone burdened by guilt? Someone manipulating the investigation from the shadows? Behavioral profilers debated whether the calls were acts of conscience or acts of control, whether the caller wanted the truth exposed or simply wanted to stay one step ahead. As attention tightened around the primary suspect, another thread emerged, one that had been overlooked in the noise of the early investigation. Financial records revealed a sudden, unexplained influx of cash in the months following the disappearance, followed by a pattern of moves, property changes, small but deliberate attempts to reshape a life without drawing attention. Nothing illegal on its own. Everything suspicious in context. Detectives revisited interviews with neighbors near the demolished structure, people who had lived there in 2002 and since moved on. One remembered hearing a generator late at night, unusual for the area, running for hours at a time. Another recalled seeing a car parked inside the building overnight, headlights off, doors closed. At the time it had seemed private, not criminal. Privacy had shielded something darker. The case, once starved for leads, now struggled under their weight. Each new piece demanded verification, demanded restraint, demanded patience. Prosecutors cautioned against moving too fast, against building a case on inference and implication. Without a body, without direct evidence tying the suspect to a crime, the margin for error was razor thin. The family was kept informed in careful fragments, each update delivered with disclaimers and softened language, each one reopening wounds that had never healed. Hope became a dangerous thing again, something that could lift and destroy in equal measure. They asked the same question they had asked for years. Where is she? And the answer remained just out of reach. Then, unexpectedly, the anonymous caller returned. This time the call was traced more precisely than before, technology having finally caught up to the tricks of the early 2000s. The signal bounced, but not far enough. Not clean enough. Investigators isolated a general area, a cluster of streets not far from the suspect's current residence. When the voice spoke, it sounded strained, hurried, as if time had finally become an enemy. You don't understand, it said. He wasn't alone. Those 3 words detonated inside the investigation. Not alone. The possibility of a second person, a witness or participant, rewrote the narrative yet again. It explained the confidence, the durability of the silence, the shared burden. Detectives immediately expanded their scope, revisiting associates, old friendships, professional ties that had gone cold after 2002. One name surfaced reluctantly, buried in paperwork and half-remembered conversations, someone who had worked closely with the suspect at the time, someone who had left town abruptly months after the disappearance, someone who had never been formally interviewed because they had never seemed central. They lived states away now, a quieter life built on distance. When investigators contacted them, the response was delayed. When it came, it was cautious. Fear threaded through every word. Arrangements were made. A meeting scheduled. Meanwhile, the suspect was released again, walking out of the station unchanged, offering a polite nod to the detectives who watched him go, knowing that time once again was working against them. As night fell, the town settled into uneasy sleep, unaware that its long-standing mystery was tightening into something more dangerous, that the cold case was no longer just a story about absence, but about control, collaboration, and secrets heavy enough to bend lives around them. Somewhere, someone was weighing the cost of silence against the risk of truth, and the balance was shifting, slowly but inexorably, toward a reckoning that had been postponed for far too long. The meeting took place in a windowless room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, a room designed to be forgettable, because forgettable rooms make people talk, and when the second man finally sat down across from investigators, it was clear that forgetting was something he had tried and failed to do for a very long time. His hands shook despite his effort to keep them still, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the detective's shoulder as if looking directly at another human being required more courage than he could afford. He had been younger back then. Everyone had been younger back then. He had worked alongside the primary suspect, shared shifts, shared jokes, shared long empty nights in places where no one was supposed to be watching. He insisted he knew nothing at first, repeating the phrase like a shield, but the rhythm of his voice betrayed him, speeding up, tripping over itself, and when investigators slid a photograph across the table, an image of the demolished storage building taken years before, it broke something loose. He stared at it too long. Long enough to be noticed. Long enough to matter. Words came slowly after that, fragmented, cautious, as if each one had to be tested for weight before being released. He said he had been there that night. Not the whole time. Just briefly. He said he hadn't planned to be. He said he had received a call asking for help with something vague, something routine, something that didn't sound dangerous until it was already too late to turn around. The story, once it started, refused to stay contained. He described arriving after midnight, the building dark except for a single light inside, the air heavy with the smell of oil and damp concrete. He described the woman sitting on the floor, hands bound, eyes wide, uninjured but terrified, asking questions no one answered. He described the suspect moving with a calm that now made sense in the worst possible way, speaking softly, giving instructions like this was a problem to be managed, not a life being dismantled. He claimed he didn't touch her, claimed he told himself it wasn't his business, claimed he left before anything irreversible happened. Investigators listened without interrupting, knowing that truth often arrives wrapped in self-preservation, knowing that every denial still confirmed something else. He could not say what happened after he left. He could not say where she went. He could only say that he regretted not calling the police, not telling anyone, not doing the one thing that might have changed the course of everything. When asked why he had waited so long, his answer was simple and devastating. Fear. Fear of the man who had orchestrated it. Fear of what admitting knowledge would cost him. Fear of becoming the villain in a story that already had one. Over time, fear had hardened into routine, into silence, into a life built carefully around a secret that refused to stay buried. His statement was not enough for an arrest. It was riddled with gaps, softened by self-interest, unsupported by physical proof. But it shifted the ground again, tilting the case toward a version of events that felt more real, more horrifying, than anything investigators had previously imagined. Control had not changed hands quickly. It had been asserted and maintained. The suspect was brought back in. this time confronted not just with evidence, but with another voice. He listened as excerpts from the statement were read aloud, his expression unchanged until a detail emerged that only someone present would know. The slight pause, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of anger that flashed and vanished. He denied everything, of course. Denials were easy. He accused the other man of lying, of shifting blame, of trying to save himself. He said the story was convenient. He said many things. What he could not explain was the convergence, the phone records, the location, the items buried beneath the demolished building, the sudden financial changes, the anonymous calls that had nudged investigators closer and closer to him, without ever crossing the line into direct accusation. That raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud, but everyone was thinking. Who had been making those calls? The second man denied it immediately, too quickly. The suspect scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as desperation. But the timing was wrong for both of them. The cadence of the voice, the knowledge it possessed, the restraint it showed. Investigators began to suspect a third presence in the story. Someone adjacent but not central. Someone who had seen enough to know the truth and just enough distance to survive it. They combed through old call logs again, matching timestamps to work schedules to movements to opportunities. One name surfaced repeatedly at the edges of the data. Never prominent, never absent. A dispatcher. A contractor. A man whose job had given him access to information and anonymity in equal measure. He had moved away years ago. He had never been interviewed. When contacted, he was cooperative to a fault, answering questions politely, almost eagerly, insisting he had nothing to hide. But when asked about the calls, about the specific detail that had first cracked the case open, his answers faltered. He said he might have heard rumors. He said people talked. He said he couldn't remember exactly. Memory, investigators knew, was selective when survival depended on it. The pressure mounted. Media attention intensified. The town fractured along familiar lines. Some convinced the truth was finally emerging. Others convinced that innocent lives were being destroyed by speculation and hindsight. Online forums lit up with theories, names, accusations. The case was no longer confined to files and interviews. It was alive again, volatile, unpredictable. Prosecutors faced an impossible choice. Move forward with what they had and risk collapse, or wait for something stronger and risk losing everything to time once more. The absence of a body loomed over every conversation, a shadow that refused to lift. Without it, the story could always be reframed. Without it, doubt could always creep back in. Then a storm rolled in, violent and sudden, tearing through the region with winds strong enough to uproot trees and flood low-lying areas. In the aftermath, as cleanup crews worked through debris near the old search site, something surfaced in the runoff, something pale and unmistakably human. The call came in quietly this time, handled with care, with restraint. Forensic teams arrived, sealing off the area yet again, aware of the weight of the moment. Partial remains. Fragmentary. Time-worn. Not enough to tell a full story, but enough to confirm what everyone had feared and needed in equal measure. She had not walked away. She had not started a new life. She had died somewhere between fear and silence, between control and neglect. Identification would take time. Confirmation would require patience. But the case had crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. The truth, long resisted, had begun to surface not as a single revelation, but as a series of unbearable facts, each one narrowing the space where denial could live. As night fell again over Florida, the town held its breath, knowing that the mystery that had haunted it for decades was no longer just about what had happened, but about who had known, who had stayed silent, and how many chances there had been to stop it before it became a cold case that refused to stay cold. Confirmation did not come with a single phone call or a dramatic announcement. It arrived in increments, in lab reports stamped with dates, in hushed conversations behind closed doors, in the way investigators' voices changed when they spoke the victim's name, no longer paired with missing, now shadowed by something heavier, something final. The remains were small, incomplete, but they carried enough markers to erase the last fragile alternative, enough to turn decades of speculation into a narrow corridor leading toward a single irreversible truth. Forensic anthropologists worked methodically, measuring, cataloging, reconstructing a timeline from fragments that time and weather had tried to erase. The cause of death was not immediately clear, the damage too extensive, the evidence too degraded, but the absence of certain injuries suggested restraint rather than chaos, control rather than panic. She had not died quickly. That detail settled into the investigation like a weight, altering every conversation, every strategy. The family was told in person. There were no cameras, no microphones, no words that could soften the impact. Grief, after years of suspended hope, took on a different shape, sharper, quieter, devastating in its certainty. They asked the same questions again, but now the answers carried a finality that could not be undone. Where was she found? How long had she been there? Did she suffer? Investigators answered what they could and held back what they had to, knowing that some truths serve justice but destroy those left behind. The discovery forced action. Prosecutors, no longer able to justify waiting, began assembling a case that could survive scrutiny, a case built not on a single piece of evidence but on accumulation, on convergence, on the slow tightening of a narrative that had been resisting definition for over 20 years. The suspect was brought in again, this time under conditions that felt different, heavier, the room colder, the questions sharper. He listened as the discovery was laid out, as timelines were aligned, as witness statements were read back to him with new emphasis. He showed restraint, but the cracks were there now, visible to anyone trained to look for them. His answers grew shorter. His posture stiffened. When asked directly about the remains, about the location, about the objects found years earlier beneath the demolished building, he did not deny knowledge. He deflected. He minimized. He shifted blame toward the second man, toward unnamed others, toward circumstances that no longer held up under the weight of what had been uncovered. The second man, confronted with the confirmation of death, broke in a way he hadn't before. His cooperation deepened, his statements more detailed, less guarded. He admitted to staying longer that night than he had initially claimed. He admitted to helping move something heavy, wrapped, silent. He insisted he believed she was already dead. Investigators noted the wording. Belief, not certainty. A distinction that mattered. With each revised statement, the picture grew clearer and more disturbing. The storage building had not been a temporary stop. It had been a holding place. A place where time stretched, where decisions were postponed, where responsibility was diluted between people until it felt almost theoretical. Control had not slipped. It had been shared. The anonymous caller did not call again after the remains were found. The silence this time felt final, as if whatever obligation had driven the previous tips had been fulfilled. Investigators revisited the theory of a third presence, someone who knew but never touched, who watched from the margins and chose intervention only when time had made it safer. The dispatcher-turned-contractor was questioned again, more intensely, his movements in 2002 mapped with new precision. He admitted to hearing something that night. He admitted to suspecting more than he ever said. He admitted to making the calls. He said he had never intended to solve the case, only to balance it, to ease something inside himself that had never let him sleep. He said he believed justice would come eventually if nudged in the right direction. Investigators did not argue with him. They documented everything. His admissions explained the restraint, the distance, the way the tips had illuminated without accusing. It did not absolve him, but it contextualized his silence. Charges were prepared carefully, word by word, anticipating every defense, every attack. The primary suspect was arrested quietly, without spectacle, taken into custody as neighbors watched from behind curtains, recognition dawning too late to matter. The second man was charged separately, his cooperation reflected but not erased by his involvement. The dispatcher faced consequences of a different kind, legal and moral, his role debated in editorials and comment sections alike. The town reacted in waves. Shock gave way to anger, anger to exhaustion. People wanted resolution, but resolution arrived complicated, fragmented, unsatisfying in the way real endings often are. There was no single villain to absorb all the blame, no clean narrative to restore order. There were only people, decisions, moments when intervention was possible and not taken. As the case moved toward trial, details leaked slowly, each one reopening wounds, each one forcing the community to confront its own proximity to the crime. The The places where it had unfolded were no longer abstract. They were streets people drove every day, buildings they had passed without noticing, spaces that had held secrets in plain sight. For investigators who had inherited the case, there was a sense of grim accomplishment, a recognition that persistence had mattered, that time had not entirely erased accountability. But there was no celebration. The victory, if it could be called that, was hollow, built on loss that could never be recovered. In court filings, the phrase cold case appeared again and again, a reminder of how long the truth had waited, how easily it might have been lost forever. The anonymous tip that had changed everything was now a footnote, a catalyst rather than a solution, proof that even incomplete truths can shift the course of history when delivered at the right moment. As Florida moved into another humid summer, the case that had defined a generation of fear began its final transformation, no longer an open question, no longer an unsolved mystery, but a story of delayed reckoning, of control mistaken for safety, of silence mistaken for survival. And even as the legal process ground forward, even as verdicts loomed on the horizon, the echo of the original disappearance lingered, a reminder that some crimes do not end when they are uncovered, that their impact stretches far beyond evidence rooms and courtrooms, settling into the collective memory of a place that will never quite be the same again. The courtroom air felt heavier than the Florida heat outside, thick with anticipation and the low murmur of people who had waited years for this moment without knowing what it would actually feel like when it arrived. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of bodies and expectations, reporters lining the back wall, pens poised, cameras banned but eyes recording everything. When the defendants were brought in, there was no cinematic eruption, no gasps or shouts, just a collective tightening, a quiet recalibration as the abstract idea of guilt took on human form. The primary suspect sat motionless, hands folded, face composed, the same controlled calm he had carried for decades, as if still believing that discipline alone could bend reality. The second man avoided eye contact, shoulders slumped, the cost of cooperation etched into every movement. Between them stretched a story the prosecution would have to tell without the comfort of a complete body, without the clarity of a single decisive moment, relying instead on accumulation, on the slow grind of evidence and inference and confession chipped away by time. Opening statements were measured, deliberate, stripped of flourish. The state spoke of control and opportunity, of a woman who trusted her routine and paid for it with her life, of choices made in darkness that rippled outward for years. The defense spoke of doubt, of unreliable memories, of self-serving witnesses and missing proof. The word cold case surfaced again, framed not as a failure of justice but as a warning against rushing to judgment after so much time had passed. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices trembling or flat, memories cracking under cross-examination. The second man testified for hours, recounting the night in fragments that grew sharper as he spoke, admitting to things he had once denied, backing away from claims that no longer held. He described the building, the restraints, the silence, the way the primary suspect spoke about the situation as if it were temporary, manageable, reversible until it wasn't. Defense attorneys pounced on inconsistencies, on changes in phrasing, on the obvious incentive to minimize his own role. The jury listened, watched, weighed. Forensic experts followed, explaining degradation, probability, what could and could not be concluded from the remains. They spoke carefully, aware that certainty was a luxury this case could not afford. A fiber analyst described similarities without claiming absolutes. An anthropologist explained trauma patterns without assigning precise cause. Each testimony added a layer, never enough alone, but collectively forming a shape that was difficult to ignore. The dispatcher's testimony drew a different kind of attention. He spoke of suspicion, of fear, of years spent convincing himself that intervention would only make things worse. He admitted to the anonymous calls, his voice steady but eyes wet, describing them not as acts of heroism but as compromises, attempts to relieve pressure without destroying the life he had built on silence. The courtroom shifted during his testimony, the line between right and wrong blurring into something more human and more troubling. Throughout it all, the family sat together, hands clasped, absorbing details they had never wanted to hear, watching strangers dissect their loss in precise legal language. They did not react visibly. Grief had long since burned away any excess emotion, leaving something quieter and more enduring. When the primary suspect finally took the stand, it was a calculated risk, one that drew a collective breath from the room. He denied intent. He denied violence. He framed his actions as misunderstandings, as attempts to help that spiraled beyond control. He spoke of panic, of poor decisions made under stress, of trusting others who betrayed him. He never spoke her name. When pressed about the duration of her confinement, about why no one was called, about why evidence was hidden rather than revealed, his answers circled, tightened, retreated. Control slipped in small ways, visible only to those trained to see it. Closing arguments came and went, days compressed into hours, the story laid out one final time from opposing angles. The jury was instructed carefully, reminded of reasonable doubt, reminded of the burden they carried. When they filed out to deliberate, the room exhaled, tension spilling into whispered conversations and hurried phone calls. The wait stretched on. Hours became days. Speculation filled the gaps. Experts weighing in on likelihoods, families and defendants alike suspended in a limbo that felt familiar and cruel. When the jury returned, faces solemn, the verdicts were delivered without drama. Guilty on some counts. Not guilty on others. Accountability fractured along legal lines that felt arbitrary to those who had lived with the story for years. Sentences were handed down later, numbers that attempted to quantify loss and responsibility, numbers that would never feel equal to what had been taken. Outside the courthouse, statements were made, microphones thrust forward, words chosen carefully. Prosecutors spoke of perseverance. Defense attorneys spoke of appeal. The family spoke briefly, thanking those who had not let the case disappear entirely, acknowledging that justice, while imperfect, had finally moved. As the legal chapter closed, the town was left with something quieter and more complex. There was no collective sigh of relief, no sense that everything had been set right. Instead, there was reflection, a turning inward, questions about proximity and silence and the cost of looking away. The places tied to the case remained, stripped now of anonymity, marked by memory. In the end, the Florida 2002 cold case was no longer defined by absence but by accumulation, by the slow erosion of secrecy, by the realization that truth does not always arrive whole or clean. It arrives in pieces carried by flawed people, delayed by fear, shaped by time. And even when it finally surfaces, even when verdicts are read and doors close behind those responsible, the echo of what happened continues, woven into the fabric of a community that will always remember the night a routine drive became a story that refused to stay buried. The appeals process began quietly, almost politely, a paperwork war fought far from cameras and candlelight vigils, and yet it carried the same weight as everything that had come before, because appeals are not about reopening wounds. They are about testing whether those wounds were stitched correctly in the first place. Legal language replaced the blunt force of testimony. Words like procedural error and evidentiary scope circling the case like scavengers, looking for weaknesses left behind by time and pressure. The primary suspect's attorneys argued that memory had been weaponized, that cooperation had been rewarded too generously, that a cold case stretched too thin becomes a mirror people project guilt into. The second man's sentence was challenged on similar grounds, his cooperation reframed as coercion, his shifting statements recast as the inevitable distortion of fear and self-interest. Each filing forced the family to relive the story again, to reopen boxes they had just managed to close, to confront the possibility that the ending they had been given might not hold. Outside the courthouse, life continued with uncomfortable normalcy. School buses ran their routes. Tourists filled beaches. New residents moved in, unaware of the names etched into local memory. The places connected to the case were still there. Some renovated, some abandoned, some erased entirely, but the knowledge lingered, a low hum beneath daily routines. People spoke differently now, more cautiously, more aware of how much can happen unseen. Journalists revisited the story with fresh angles, focusing less on the crime itself and more on the delays, the missed chances, the years when silence was mistaken for resolution. Editorials questioned how many similar cases sat dormant, waiting for technology or guilt or coincidence to align just enough to matter. The phrase cold case took on a sharper edge, no longer a neutral descriptor but an indictment of time and complacency. The dispatcher faded from public view, his role debated endlessly by strangers who would never know the exact weight of the nights, he spent listening to his own conscience. Some called him a coward. Others called him a reluctant catalyst. He accepted neither label publicly, retreating into anonymity, carrying consequences that did not fit neatly into sentencing guidelines or moral absolution. For the second man, prison brought a different kind of reckoning. Removed from the scaffolding of denial, he began to speak more openly to therapists, to chaplains, to anyone willing to listen. He admitted to moments he had tried to forget, to the ways fear had disguised itself as reason, to how easily responsibility can be diluted when shared. His words never reached the family directly, filtered instead through reports and summaries, because some truths, even when offered, are not owed an audience. The primary suspect remained defiant, filing motions, granting interviews through intermediaries, insisting that history would judge him differently. He spoke of being scapegoated, of a system eager to close a chapter regardless of nuance. Control, even now, remained central to his identity, visible in the way he framed every sentence, the way he avoided naming harm without denying events outright. Years edged forward again, slower this time, measured not in search efforts or tip lines but in court dates and parole reviews. The case became a reference point in training seminars, a cautionary tale about early assumptions and evidence handling, about how proximity to power can shield behavior until it's too late. Investigators who had worked it retired one by one, carrying with them the knowledge that persistence matters, but timing matters more. The family found their own rhythm, one built around memory rather than waiting. They held a private memorial near the place the remains had surfaced, choosing a quiet morning when the air was still, when the water reflected more sky than history. They spoke her name aloud, not as a question, not as a plea, but as a fact. She had lived. She had mattered. She had been taken. Occasionally, new tips still came in, echoes of attention rather than substance, people connecting unrelated dots, hoping to insert themselves into a story that had already hardened into record. Each tip was logged, acknowledged, set aside. The case was no longer open, but it was not finished either. Closure, investigators knew, is a word used mostly by those who don't have to live with its absence. In classrooms and community meetings, the story was retold with emphasis on vigilance, on the danger of assuming familiarity equals safety. Parents warned children. Neighbors checked in on neighbors. The town tried, in small ways, to learn from what had happened without letting it define everything that came after. And yet, on certain nights, when the humidity pressed down and the roads shimmered under streetlights, the old unease returned. People remembered the abandoned car by the pond, the radio still playing, the way normality had cracked open without warning. They remembered how long it took for the truth to surface, how many people had passed through the edges of the story without realizing they were close to something terrible. The Florida 2002 cold case had been broken, yes, but breaking does not always mean ending. Sometimes it means exposure, a fracture that reveals the internal structure of a community, its strengths and its failures laid bare. Sometimes it means living with answers that do not soothe, with justice that arrives late and incomplete. As time continued its slow work, the case settled into history, cited, analyzed, remembered, its lessons carried forward by those willing to look. And beneath all of it, beneath the legal outcomes and public discourse, remained the simplest, most enduring truth. A woman went out one night expecting to come home, and the space she left behind reshaped an entire town. A reminder that the most devastating stories often begin without warning and end not with resolution, but with a quiet, permanent change in the way people see the dark. Time did what it always does after the headlines fade. It thinned the crowd. It softened the outrage. It left behind a quieter residue, something less visible but harder to escape. The case stopped leading the evening news, stopped trending, stopped being something people argued about loudly, and became something they carried instead, tucked into the back of their minds, surfacing at odd moments when a familiar road felt suddenly unfamiliar. When a stranger's calm lingered a second too long. In official records, the Florida 2002 cold case was marked resolved, a word that looked clean on paper and felt false in the chest. Resolved did not account for the years of silence, the missed intersections where one decision could have changed everything. Resolved did not explain how easily control can masquerade as competence, how authority can dull instinct, how fear can convince good people that doing nothing is a form of survival. The storage site was paved over again, repurposed, its brief notoriety smoothed out by time and zoning permits. No plaque marked it. No sign warned passers-by what had once happened there. Life moved forward because it always does, indifferent to the need for memorials. And yet, for those who knew, the ground never quite settled. The detective who had noticed the reflection in the car window retired shortly after the trial, leaving behind a desk cleared of everything but a single photograph, the victim smiling at some forgotten event, her face still carrying a future she never reached. He said later that the case had taught him something no academy ever could. That truth rarely announces itself, that it waits to be noticed by someone willing to look twice when everyone else has already looked away. The prosecutor took a teaching position, using the case as an example of narrative versus proof, of how stories can mislead and clarify in equal measure. She spoke often about restraint, about the danger of certainty, about the responsibility that comes with resurrecting the past. Students listened, some inspired, some uneasy, sensing that the law, like memory, is less solid than it appears. The family learned to live with anniversaries that no longer came with updates. Birthdays were marked privately. Holidays passed with an empty chair that no one else was allowed to fill. They stopped correcting people who spoke about her in the past tense incorrectly, stopped explaining details to those who asked out of curiosity rather than care. Grief, after so many years, became less about loss and more about stewardship, about protecting the truth of who she had been from the distortion of headlines and speculation. In quieter moments, questions still surfaced. Not legal questions, human ones. At what point does fear become a choice? At what point does silence become participation? These questions had no defendants, no verdicts, no sentencing guidelines. They lived instead in conversations that trailed off, in thoughts interrupted by discomfort. The second man wrote letters he never sent, pages filled with explanations that felt thin even to him. In therapy sessions, he spoke about the moment he realized he could leave and did. About how relief had arrived first, guilt later. About how time had taught him that survival without integrity is a slower kind of collapse. None of this appeared in transcripts. None of it altered his sentence. It existed only as internal accounting, a ledger no court could balance. The primary suspects' appeals dwindled, one by one denied. The language increasingly firm, increasingly final. His world contracted to routines measured in counts and lights and schedules. Control, once his defining trait, was now reduced to trivialities, the order of his belongings, the cadence of his day. He continued to insist on misinterpretation, on overreach, on being misunderstood. But even among those who listened out of obligation, the words lost their force. Time, relentless and unsympathetic, stripped them of urgency. Occasionally, a new documentary crew would arrive, microphones polished, questions rehearsed, looking to reframe the story, to find some unexplored angle that could justify another retelling. Most were turned away. A few were allowed limited access, guided carefully through facts already known, warned away from sensationalism that served no one. The family understood that stories, once released, cannot be reclaimed, only shaped. The town itself changed shape. New developments rose where empty lots had been. Old diners closed. New names appeared on mailboxes. But certain landmarks remained fixed in collective memory, not because they were marked, but because people remembered how they had felt standing near them years ago, when uncertainty was still the dominant emotion. Late at night, patrol officers still slowed near the retention pond where the car had been found, an unconscious habit passed down from veterans to rookies who didn't know the origin of the caution. The water looked the same. The road sounded the same. But the air carried a residue of story, a sense that ordinary places can become thresholds without warning. In training sessions, the case was cited again and again, not for its dramatic twists but for its quiet failures. Evidence mishandled. Assumptions left unchallenged. Voices discounted because they didn't fit the prevailing narrative. The lesson was not that justice always prevails, but that it depends on vigilance, humility, and a willingness to revisit what feels settled. Years later, a college student researching cold cases would stumble across the file, reading it not as lived experience but as data, timelines, scanned documents. To them it would be a puzzle, tragic but distant. And yet, even at that remove, the weight would register, the sense that something essential had been lost in the space between what was known and what was acted upon. The anonymous calls, once so central, became a footnote in most retellings, a reminder that intervention does not always arrive cleanly or courageously. Sometimes it arrives sideways, compromised, delayed. Sometimes it does just enough. On certain humid evenings, when thunderstorms rolled in fast and loud, residents still remembered the night everything began, not because of what they had seen, but because of what they hadn't. A woman driving home. A promise of 15 minutes. A silence that stretched into decades. The Florida 2002 cold case no longer demanded attention, but it had not released its hold. It lingered in the way people hesitated before assuming safety, in the way they listened a little longer, questioned a little deeper. It lingered as proof that mystery is not always about the unknown, but about what is known too late. And somewhere between the official resolution and the private reckonings, between records closed and memories kept open, the story continued to do its quiet work, reshaping perception, reminding anyone willing to listen that the most dangerous moments are often the ones that look ordinary, that evil rarely announces itself, and that the true cost of a cold case is measured not only in years without answers, but in the countless lives subtly altered by the waiting. Even as years accumulated like dust on forgotten shelves, the Florida 2002 cold case refused to disappear completely. The court files sat neatly in archives labeled resolved, but the weight of absence, the texture of silence, remained palpable to anyone who had ever walked through the streets that carried its shadow. New residents arrived, oblivious to the layers beneath asphalt and stucco, while old neighbors carried the memory like a low hum, never loud, never spoken but always present. Investigators who had retired began to speak cautiously, in interviews and panel discussions, emphasizing lessons over details. They spoke of delayed tips, of fear masquerading as discretion, of how control and intimidation can hold people in place long after the initial act. They warned that cold cases are not frozen. They are suspended, oscillating between forgotten and remembered, always waiting for someone to notice the details others overlook. They reminded audiences that the fragile line between inaction and complicity is one that bends too easily under pressure. In the community, the annual anniversaries of her disappearance passed quietly. There were no public events, no televised segments. Her family marked the day privately, lighting candles and speaking her name into rooms that carried both memory and emptiness. They remembered small details, the color of her coat, the way she laughed at something minor, the car she drove, the streets she traversed with ease. Those details were preserved fiercely, like talismans against forgetting. The storage site, long demolished and repurposed, became mundane in its new form. A parking lot, a warehouse, a place that looked like any other. Yet, for some who had been present in 2002, standing there now evoked the same prickling unease, the memory of darkness condensed into the corners of a building, the echo of footsteps across cement. Some stopped when they drove past, unconsciously slowing, remembering what could have been seen if only attention had been sharper, if only fear had loosened its grip for a single moment. In law schools and criminal justice seminars, the case became more than a story. It became a study of process, of delay, of the intersection between memory and time. Students debated hypothetical variations. What if the tip had arrived earlier? What if the second man had spoken first? What if the dispatcher had acted differently? In each scenario, the story mutated, but the underlying tension, the fragility of truth, remained. The primary suspect, now well into middle age, moved through life behind layers of routine and containment. Appeals had failed, sentences had been served, but the shape of his control remained, shrunk and precise. He remained defiant in interviews, presenting himself as a misunderstood figure, a man ensnared by circumstance rather than choice. Yet, in private, those who had monitored him reported subtle changes, lines around his eyes, pauses in speech, a faint tremor when confronted with names connected to that night. Control, once absolute, had thinned like old varnish. The second man lived with a different kind of weight. His cooperation had lessened his sentence, but it had not lightened his conscience. Therapy became a refuge, a space to untangle the years of regret and fear, to trace the path of decisions that had kept him silent, to measure the cost of inaction. He admitted to himself that morality is not always recognized in real time, that courage often arrives after the moment has passed. New tips continued to trickle in over the years, though mostly irrelevant, misremembered, or coincidental. Each was logged, reviewed, and often discarded, yet they served as reminders that stories like this never truly end. Even decades later, someone might notice an overlooked detail, connect a loose thread, and push the narrative forward again. Cold cases by nature are restless, demanding vigilance long after the initial events have concluded. The media occasionally revisited the story, framing it in the context of cold case breakthroughs, advances in forensic technology, or renewed public interest in historical crimes. Each retelling emphasized the long wait, the resilience of investigative teams, and the eventual uncovering of what had remained hidden. But even the most sensationalized reports could not capture the undercurrent of dread. The invisible ways the case had rippled through everyday life, altering routines, suspicions, and community trust. Technology, too, reframed the narrative. Digital archives allowed new generations to access court filings, police notes, and photographs. Social media rekindled discussions that had long since quieted, with forums dissecting every action, every delay, every word spoken in testimony. Some debated moral responsibility, others speculated on alternatives. The story took on life beyond the town, beyond its residents, reaching into corners of curiosity and obsession, carrying the emotional weight across time zones and generations. Through it all, one constant remained: the absence of her presence. That absence defined the story more than evidence, more than verdicts, more than procedural triumphs. Every account, every retelling, every reflection centered on the fact that she had been taken too early, that a life ended, and that her story, while now partially reconstructed, remained incomplete in ways that legal language could never capture. Even after decades, the echoes of the case lingered in Florida's humid nights, in thunderstorms that rolled in without warning, in the quiet hum of streets that had once seemed ordinary. People remembered the small, seemingly trivial signs of her final hours, the misplaced objects, the sudden changes in routine, the moments where curiosity or intervention could have altered everything. And as long as those memories persisted, the Florida 2002 cold case continued to shape consciousness, teaching, haunting, warning, and reminding that some mysteries, once awakened, never truly sleep. The courtroom lights had dimmed years ago, but their imprint lingered in the minds of everyone who had watched the Florida 2002 cold case unfold. Trials, verdicts, sentences, they were markers but not conclusions. They were the punctuation in a sentence that refused to end, a narrative stretching across decades that no single ruling could contain. Even as the town moved forward, the story embedded itself in rhythms of daily life, subtle, inescapable, a quiet tremor beneath mundane routines. Investigators who had touched the case long ago carried it with them like a scar. Some described dreams of missing pieces, the images of a woman they had never met, and yet whose absence felt like a personal failure. For others, retirement offered space but not release. They reviewed old files, scanned photographs, and revisited timelines, not in hope of a new breakthrough, but to measure how near justice had come, and how often it had been delayed by the smallest of oversights. The family remained vigilant in their own ways. They monitored parole hearings, responded to inquiries, and privately recorded anniversaries of her disappearance and eventual discovery. Their home carried relics of memory: photographs, letters, small objects that reminded them of the person they had lost, and the long stretch of uncertainty that followed. They spoke her name as if invoking it could anchor reality, insisting that the world remember her as she had been, not only as a case number. The storage building, demolished and repurposed, became a symbol of something broader. The way ordinary places hide extraordinary truths, the ease with which life continues over top of darkness. Even new constructions failed to erase the mental map the community had drawn, a map tracing absence, suspicion, and fear. Residents who lived nearby avoided certain areas without consciously acknowledging why. Their instincts shaped by memories too subtle to describe but too potent to ignore. In the public sphere, the story became both warning and lesson. Legal seminars dissected it as an illustration of delayed intervention. Journalism courses cited it as an example of narrative shaping through incomplete information. Online forums debated the moral responsibility of witnesses and bystanders. The phrase cold case acquired a sharper resonance, emphasizing not only time but the ethical weight of waiting, observing, and deciding whether to act. The dispatcher who had initiated anonymous tips faded entirely from public discussion, a shadow figure whose motivations were debated, but whose presence remained essential. He had acted indirectly, nudging the investigation forward without exposing himself, walking a line between intervention and avoidance. His role remained morally ambiguous. Neither hero nor villain, only a human caught between conscience and fear. Meanwhile, the second man adjusted to life in confinement. Therapy sessions became confessionals in miniature, spaces where he could recount details he had once concealed. He grappled with the dissonance of guilt mitigated by cooperation, the relief of sentence reduction tempered by the memory of complicity. In his private reflections, he admitted that the true weight of the crime was not legal but moral, residing in moments that no statute could fully address. The primary suspect's defiance persisted, yet time had altered the landscape in which it existed. Appeals were exhausted. Legal loopholes had closed. His narrative, once commanding, had been reduced to repetition. His control contracted into minutiae of daily routine. Observation reports noted a subtle resignation in his movements, a faint acknowledgement that the public narrative had moved beyond his framing, leaving him isolated in a world of his own making. Across the town, stories continued to ripple, unspoken yet powerful. Teachers recounted the case to students, not for sensationalism but for instruction. Neighbors reminded neighbors to watch, to question, to be present. The streets themselves seemed to remember, their ordinary intersections forever haunted by what had occurred decades before, a collective memory woven into the physical and psychological fabric of the community. In media retrospectives, the case was summarized efficiently, often emphasizing resolution over nuance, the breakthrough over the human cost. Yet those who had lived it knew the truth. Resolution had come, yes, but it was partial, uneven, forever tinged by delay. The discovery of remains had brought clarity, but not peace. Legal victories had brought accountability, but not closure. Time had offered perspective, but not forgiveness. The Florida 2002 cold case had transitioned from headline to historical reference, yet it remained alive in a quieter, more enduring way. Its lessons persisted in vigilance, in ethical reckoning, in the persistent hum of uncertainty that follows trauma. Even decades later, on nights when the air hung thick and the world felt larger and more opaque, people remembered the woman whose routine became a catastrophe, the lives intertwined in the consequences of silence, and the enduring truth that time does not erase responsibility, it only changes the way it is carried. And so the story lingered, not in newspapers or courtrooms, but in memory, in anticipation, in the subtle vigilance of a town reshaped forever by what had begun as an ordinary evening and ended in a quiet, relentless transformation of everyone who bore witness. Decades had passed, yet the Florida 2002 cold case remained alive, not in news cycles or trending hashtags, but in the spaces between moments, in the pauses of thought, in the way people instinctively checked the rearview mirror a little longer, hesitated before answering the door, or noticed patterns they once would have ignored. The town had moved forward. Shops opened and closed, streets were repaved, new families arrived, but memory had a stubborn weight, invisible yet pervasive, pressing against the rhythm of ordinary life. The family had built their lives around absence, structuring each day to accommodate the void she left behind. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, they persisted quietly, rituals of remembrance that no media could replicate, and no courtroom could validate. They carried stories in their voices, the small details of her laughter, her habits, the color of her coat, even the way she had navigated her world, preserving them as shields against forgetting. Their grief was no longer raw, but a constant presence, a silent testimony that lived outside the scope of law or narrative. For the second man, incarceration became both punishment and reflection. Therapy sessions dug into the cracks of fear and compliance, revealing moments where silence had been chosen over action, expedience over morality. He confronted the reality that accountability is rarely neat, rarely immediate, and that cooperation cannot erase the weight of past choices. He measured his guilt, not in years or days, but in the intangible toll of knowing what could have been prevented. The primary suspect, older now, moved with the precision of habit. Appeals had dried up. Legal maneuvering could no longer shield him. His defiance remained, Yet the contours of control had diminished. Observers noted subtle shifts, pauses when confronted with names tied to the case, micro-expressions betraying awareness that his narrative no longer dominated the room. He was a man measured by his routines, trapped in the cage of his own design, a shadow of the confidence he once wielded so effectively. The dispatcher, long vanished from public attention, remained a ghostly figure in analyses of the case. Scholars debated the moral implications of his anonymity, dissected the timing of his tips, and questioned the thin line between inaction and intervention. He was neither lauded nor condemned, existing as a reminder that human choices are rarely binary, and courage often arrives imperfectly, delayed, or indirectly. Across town, the physical markers of the case were gone, replaced by new constructions and familiar streets. Yet landmarks remained mentally, etched into collective consciousness. The road where she vanished, the pond where the car had been abandoned, the neighborhood corners that suddenly seemed stranger than they should have. The ordinary had been infused with latent memory, and residents lived with it without naming it, aware that terror does not always roar. It sometimes lingers quietly, reshaping perception. In classrooms, law seminars, and training sessions, the Florida 2002 cold case became a touchstone. It was studied as an exemplar of investigative persistence, of how evidence can linger unconnected, of how human error, delay, and silence can compound over years. Students and trainees debated hypothetical outcomes, explored procedural nuances, and recognized that the human element, fear, hesitation, morality, can weigh as heavily as physical proof. Occasionally, new tips emerged, echoes of interest from distant observers, coincidences, or mistaken recollections. Each was logged, investigated, and dismissed if irrelevant. The case file, though legally closed, remained active in memory, proof that closure in paperwork rarely equals closure in reality. Cold cases, by their nature, are never entirely dormant. They live in the awareness of possibility, in the latent hope that a single thread might surface to tie loose ends together. Media retrospectives revisited the story with varying tones: human interest, procedural triumph, cautionary tale. But none could capture the persistent hum of tension that had defined the lived experience. Resolution had arrived in legal terms, yet the emotional landscape remained uneven, textured with unanswered questions, with the shadow of what had been taken too soon, and with the quiet ripple effects across lives never fully restored. And still the town moved, aware yet resigned. Ordinary days were punctuated by the unspoken knowledge that the past does not entirely yield to present comfort. The Florida 2002 cold case had changed perception, altered behavior, and reshaped the moral compass of the community. It was a reminder that vigilance matters, that silence carries consequences, and that time does not erase the echoes of trauma. It merely shifts the way they are felt. In the end, the story did not conclude with justice alone. It lingered in memory, in reflection, in the subtleties of daily life. It persisted in the quiet moments when someone noticed a car in the wrong place, a shadow where it shouldn't be, a hesitation that felt familiar. The case had been broken, verdicts delivered, and sentences imposed, yet its resonance continued, an enduring testament to the fragility of safety, the weight of choice, and the haunting persistence of absence. The Florida 2002 cold case was resolved on paper, yet unresolved in consequence, teaching the living that some stories never end, that justice arrives in pieces, and that the space left by a single person's disappearance can stretch across decades, altering everything in its path, shaping a community, and leaving a quiet, permanent shadow that reminds everyone that the ordinary world can conceal extraordinary darkness. Decades later, the Florida 2002 cold case lingered in the corners of memory like a faint, persistent echo, a shadow that refused to dissipate. Streets had been repaved, neighborhoods renamed, businesses opened and closed, yet some corners still held tension, the residue of fear woven into asphalt and sidewalks. New generations walked the same paths unaware, but old instincts remained with those who remembered. The hesitation at intersections, the unspoken caution in a glance, the feeling that ordinary spaces could conceal extraordinary danger. The family, now older, had transformed grief into quiet vigilance. They spoke less in public but recorded memories privately, compiling photographs, letters, and recollections, constructing a chronology of presence to resist erasure. Each anniversary they lit candles, not for closure but to affirm that she had existed, that her life mattered beyond headlines and trial transcripts. Memory had become their measure of justice. The second man, now decades into his sentence, carried the psychological toll of his choices like an invisible ledger. Therapy and reflection had revealed the subtle ways fear and inaction compounded, creating consequences far beyond legal judgment. He recognized that survival without integrity leaves permanent marks. Even with cooperation, the echo of guilt was inescapable, lodged in the quiet corners of his mind. Every minor act of vigilance now reminded him of moments when he had failed. The primary suspect, older and still defiant, moved through life in routines defined by restriction. His control, once absolute, had diminished into trivialities, the order of his possessions, the cadence of each day. Appeals were exhausted. Legal maneuvering offered no comfort. Observation reports noted a subtle resignation, a recognition that the narrative had escaped his influence, leaving him confined not only physically but narratively, a man reduced to a shadow of his former certainty. The dispatcher's role remained a ghostly question in academic discussions, law seminars, and online debates. Was his indirect intervention courage, or a reluctant act born of fear? Scholars dissected the ethics of anonymity, the timing of tip-offs, the moral weight of partial action. He had nudged the case forward without entering the spotlight, leaving observers to debate his choices, ensuring that ambiguity remained a central theme in the story's legacy. New tips still trickled in sporadically, decades later, misremembered fragments, coincidences, or distant curiosities, but each was logged, reviewed, and archived. The file remained active, legally dormant but morally alive. Cold cases by nature are never entirely closed. They persist in collective vigilance, in the hope that a single overlooked thread might someday connect, in the tension between what is known and what is still possible. Technology transformed the case's presence in the public sphere. Digital archives, scanned evidence, and forum discussions allowed generations far removed from the original events to examine the narrative, analyze the timeline, debate motives. Social media revived the story, reframing it in terms of patterns, ethics, and human behavior. The Florida 2002 cold case became more than a crime. It became a study of human error, delayed courage, and the fragility of trust. The town itself remembered, whether consciously or not. Even as redevelopment erased the physical traces of the crime, landmarks survived in memory. The road where she vanished, the pond where the car had been abandoned, the spaces where ordinary life had once been shattered. Residents avoided certain streets, slowed at intersections, remembered the invisible weight pressing over the town, proof that the past never fully leaves, even when erased from maps. In law schools, criminal justice programs, and investigative training, the case endured as a cautionary tale. It was cited for lessons in procedural delay, overlooked evidence, witness psychology, and ethical ambiguity. Students debated hypothetical scenarios. What if the tip had arrived earlier? What if cooperation had come sooner? What if the dispatcher had acted differently? In every discussion, the case demonstrated the limits of certainty and the consequences of hesitation. And still the core truth persisted, unaltered by time. A woman had disappeared. She had been taken too soon. Her life, interrupted, left an indelible mark not only on her family but on the community, the investigators, the suspects, and the culture surrounding cold cases. Resolution in court had been partial, legal closure achieved, but the story's emotional resonance stretched across decades, infiltrating memory, shaping perception, altering behavior. On certain humid nights, when the wind carried the scent of salt water and the distant rumble of thunderstorms, old residents remembered. They recalled her smile, the mundane habits that became extraordinary through absence, the suspended possibility of intervention, the haunting weight of silence. Even decades later, the Florida 2002 cold case had not ended. It persisted as a caution, as a moral test, as a ghostly reminder that darkness can hide in the ordinary, and that some absences echo indefinitely, shaping lives far beyond the original moment. And in that echo the case remained alive, resolved on paper, unresolved in consequence, a silent teacher in the town, whispering the same lesson to anyone willing to remember. Vigilance matters, inaction has cost, and the ordinary world is never as safe as it seems. The Florida 2002 cold case had been broken, yes, but its shadow stretched forward relentless, shaping the present with the weight of what had once been lost, and what may never be fully recovered. Years beyond what anyone expected, the Florida 2002 cold case continued to ripple quietly through the town, a ghost story anchored in reality. Streets had changed, neighborhoods transformed, yet the memory of that night remained, not in signs or plaques, but in the rhythm of life itself, subtle hesitations, sideways glances, instinctive vigilance that no reconstruction could erase. Even new generations, born long after the disappearance and eventual discovery, seemed to carry its residue, as though the air itself remembered. Investigators long retired still spoke of it in hushed tones, at reunions, in memoirs, and in training seminars. They dissected old decisions, replayed timelines in their heads, measured how moments of courage or their absence had shaped the outcome. Some admitted that the moral weight of the case had never left them, a quiet companion in otherwise ordinary lives. Every routine patrol, every cold case file, reminded them that certainty is fragile, and that human error, delay, or hesitation can have permanent consequences. The family, now older and weathered, preserved her memory with deliberate care. They collected photographs, letters, fragments of her life, building a private archive of presence. Candles still burned on anniversaries. Voices still whispered her name. In every private ritual, they affirmed a truth the legal system could not fully contain. That she had existed, that her life mattered, and that loss is never fully reconciled, only carried forward in memory and in small, deliberate acts of remembrance. The second man, decades older and weighed by conscience, reflected constantly on the choices he had made. Therapy had become a form of daily reckoning. He measured guilt not in years served but in the invisible consequences of silence, in the lives altered by what he did not prevent. He recognized that morality is rarely instantaneous. It accumulates slowly, often painfully, until it can no longer be ignored. Survival without courage leaves scars deeper than any sentence could. The primary suspect had grown into routine, his control now diminished to trivialities. Appeals exhausted, his defiance persisted only in small gestures, the rigid cadence of daily life, the meticulous order of objects he could still manage. Yet subtle cracks appeared, a hesitation, a fleeting recognition that his narrative no longer dominated. Time had eroded more than freedom. It had eroded influence, certainty, the power to shape memory. Technological advancements brought the case back into the public eye in unexpected ways. Digital archives, AI-assisted analysis, and public databases allowed fresh eyes to examine old files, to notice overlooked details, to reinterpret evidence with a clarity unavailable in 2002. Online forums debated motives, ethics, and procedural errors. The story, though decades old, had migrated into collective consciousness far beyond the town itself. Cold cases, it seemed, are never truly dormant. They lie in wait, ready to awaken in any mind willing to look. Occasionally, a new anonymous tip would arrive, cryptic or incomplete, but enough to remind authorities that the case still mattered. These messages, years late, carried with them the same tension as the original tips, evidence that the past refuses to remain quiet. Even when nothing actionable surfaced, the reminders reinforced a truth too often overlooked. Resolution on paper does not erase the human stakes. The town itself retained the imprint of the event. Long-forgotten roads, unremarkable buildings, familiar intersections, all were haunted in memory. Residents moved through ordinary life with an unconscious caution, a sense that what seems mundane can hide danger, and that ordinary evenings may mask extraordinary consequences. The cityscape had changed, but the emotional topography remained, invisible yet palpable. In classrooms and police academies, the Florida 2002 cold case was cited as a lesson in vigilance, ethics, and the long shadow of human error. Students debated hypothetical interventions. What if evidence had been acted on sooner? What if cooperation had been earlier? What if fear had not dictated silence? Each discussion reaffirmed the fundamental lesson. Justice is never automatic. It is contingent on action, courage, and awareness, and it often arrives incomplete. Even as the official files gathered dust, the story remained active in memory. The echo of absence had lasting weight, reshaping behavior, perception, and the moral compass of the community. Resolution had come, but the emotional resonance persisted. The past refused to be fully settled, asserting itself in quiet reminders, ethical reflections, and the subtle rhythms of daily life. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Florida, on humid nights when the wind carried the scent of distant water and the world felt unusually still, the memory of that vanished woman stirred again. It reminded everyone that some absences never fade, that choices reverberate across decades, and that the ordinary world can conceal extraordinary darkness. The Florida 2002 cold case had been broken, yes, but it remained alive in consequence, a permanent shadow shaping consciousness, vigilance, and memory, teaching that even resolved cases can never be fully closed in the hearts of those who lived them. It had been more than 2 decades since that night, yet the Florida 2002 cold case refused to settle into history. For most, it existed only in fading memory in newspaper archives in law school lectures. But in a small high-tech forensic lab on the outskirts of the city, something stirred that would shake the story loose again. DNA samples, long considered inconclusive, were re-examined with technology that had been unimaginable in 2002. Algorithms sifted through patterns, connecting fragments that had once been dismissed as noise. Every detail, every overlooked swab, every trace of contamination was now a clue waiting to be recognized. Investigators, both old and new, gathered quietly around screens, their eyes scanning data that decades ago would have been meaningless. They compared sequences, timelines, and evidence logs with forensic precision, the glow of monitors illuminating faces etched by memory and frustration. For those who had worked the case originally, it was a strange mixture of hope and dread, the sense that finally some measure of closure could emerge, yet the fear that decades of waiting had made the consequences permanent. The family, long resigned to the limits of law and time, received a phone call that seemed impossible. A lab technician's voice, measured, cautious, suggested that evidence once thought inert now pointed toward a person who had never been fully implicated. They listened in stunned silence, heartbeats caught between disbelief and anticipation. Memories of the missing daughter, once painful in private reflection, surged with renewed intensity. The past, long a quiet shadow, was now demanding presence. The primary suspect, older, had lived decades with a defiance tempered by the inevitability of time. Yet the news of renewed investigation shook his carefully constructed routines. Interviews were requested, DNA samples revisited, alibis scrutinized under the harsh light of modern analysis. The cracks of hesitation that had first appeared years ago widened. Even control, once absolute, was proving insufficient against technology that could track, measure, and reconstruct truths once hidden. Meanwhile, the second man, now living under supervised release, learned of the breakthrough with a mixture of fear and resignation. His cooperation in the original investigation had once mitigated consequences, but the resurgence of evidence reopened old wounds. He realized that moral reckoning is rarely final, that choices echo indefinitely, and that the past refuses to be fully contained. Even after decades of silence and reflection, media outlets caught wind of the development almost immediately, framing it as a cold case revival, with the drama and urgency of a thriller. Social media buzzed with speculation. Timelines were reconstructed, evidence re-examined, every overlooked detail suddenly a potential key. The story, once a local shadow, now stretched into national consciousness again. Audiences followed digital updates like headlines unfolding in real time, unaware that what they witnessed was not just procedure, but the revival of a decades-old moral and emotional landscape. The town itself stirred with unease. Streets and corners once thought ordinary now felt charged, heavy with the weight of memory and anticipation. Residents who had long carried the story quietly sensed a shift. The ordinary rhythm of life was intersecting with the extraordinary resurgence of a past event. Even mundane locations, the pond, the intersections, the old warehouse, took on renewed significance, as if the landscape itself had been waiting for recognition. In the lab, a connection finally emerged. DNA matched to a secondary peripheral suspect, someone who had existed on the edges of the original investigation, overlooked not by negligence but by the limitations of 2002 technology. Names, dates, and events fell into sharper alignment, threads of a tangled web finally drawing toward clarity. The room held its collective breath as the implications became undeniable. Decades of uncertainty were about to meet a measure of truth. Law enforcement prepared cautiously. Arrests, interrogations, legal filings, all proceeded with the careful precision of long-delayed justice. The town braced itself, aware that revelation would not erase trauma, would not restore what had been lost, but might finally answer questions that had haunted generations. The weight of absence, once intangible, would now confront the present. For the family, for investigators, for the community, the case's resurgence was proof that time does not erase consequence, and that cold cases are never truly silent. Even decades later, they demand attention, vigilance, and courage. And as the Florida 2002 cold case moved into a new chapter, it carried forward the same lesson it had always held. The past waits patiently, shadows linger, and justice, long delayed, arrives with the force of memory itself. In that resurgence, the town, the family, and even the perpetrators were reminded that absence leaves echoes, that silence carries weight, and that a case thought resolved can awaken again, casting its long, relentless shadow across the present, forcing the living to confront what they once hoped had vanished into history. The Florida 2002 cold case was no longer just a story of what happened. It had become a story of what persists, a story proving that some mysteries never fully die.